Every week we open a new haunted report. Tonight, the possession of Polly Williams. Chapter 1. The Williams family. The Williams family lived on the far edge of Willow Creek, a small, tight-knit farming village in one of the endless flyover states. The kind of town where everyone knew each other's names, where the church bell on Sundays was the loudest sound you would hear for miles, and where children played in dirt roads long after the sun went down. The Williams house was old, built in the 1920s by a grandfather who had believed land was all a man really needed. The wooden beams creaked in the wind, the paint peeled in strips, and the field stretched out like an ocean of waving stalks. It was not glamorous, but it was home. Inside lived 5 souls. Daniel Williams, the father, worked as a mechanic in town. He was a practical man with oil permanently etched into his skin, a man who fixed problems with his hands, not prayers or superstitions. His wife Sarah was gentler, a teacher's aide at the local school, with the patience of someone who had spent her life answering children's endless questions. Their children filled the home with noise and life. Thomas at 12 was the oldest, caught between responsibility and the restless desire to run off into the world. Emily, only 5, was the youngest, shy and soft-spoken, often clinging to her mother's skirts. And then there was Polly. Polly Williams was 7 when the strangeness began, even before she had been different. She spoke of shadows no one else could see, pointed at corners where nothing stood, and once told her brother that a woman in black whispered to her at night. Thomas laughed, Emily cried, and their parents dismissed it as imagination. Children invented things, Sarah would say, and Polly's imagination was simply more vivid than most. But sometimes, when Polly stared into the dark at night, her lips parted as though listening. Even Daniel felt a flicker of unease. Polly was not sickly, but she was quiet. Her hair hung in pale strands around her face, her eyes a curious gray that seemed older than her years. She did not play as loudly as Emily or run as fast as Thomas. Instead, she would sit in the grass humming to herself, as though the tune came from someplace else. One autumn evening, when the air smelled of hay and the sunset bled red into the horizon, Polly asked her mother a strange question. "Mom," she said, tugging at Sarah's hand as they cleared the dinner table, "what happens when people don't want to stay gone?" Sarah blinked. "Stay gone, after they die," Polly clarified, her tone flat, too calm for a child. "What if they still want to be here?" Sarah hesitated, unease crawling into her chest. "That's not how it works, sweetheart. When people die, they move on, they go to heaven, remember?" Polly tilted her head. Not all of them that night. Thomas overheard Polly humming again in her room, though the tune sounded different, low and strange, almost like chanting. When he asked her about it the next morning, she only smiled in a way that made him uncomfortable. The Williams family went about their lives, but unease had already begun its quiet work. Polly spoke less at dinner, her skin palling. Sometimes she would stare at her siblings with wide eyes unblinking until they begged her to stop. And Polly herself, though she never said it aloud, knew she was being watched by something neither child nor adult could truly understand, something that wanted her. Chapter 2. The first sign came on a night thick with summer heat. The windows of the Williams house were cracked open, letting in the hum of crickets and the occasional sigh of wind through the fields. Sarah had tucked Emily into bed. Thomas was sprawled out with a comic book, and Polly sat quietly at her desk drawing. It was Thomas who noticed it first. A glass of water, set firmly on the nightstand beside his bed, shifted an inch across the wood. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and told himself it was his imagination. But when he leaned closer, he saw faint ripples in the water, as if something had tapped the glass from the inside. By morning, Polly was pale and sluggish. She barely touched her breakfast. Sarah asked if she felt sick. Polly only shrugged, her eyes heavy. That evening, the disturbances grew bolder. The family was gathered around the old oak dining table when the overhead light flickered. Daniel muttered about wiring, but then the salt shaker tipped over, spilling in a perfect line across the table. Everyone froze. Even Daniel could not explain how the shaker had moved without a hand. Thomas's eyes darted to Polly. She was staring at the spill, lips parted, breath shallow. From that day forward, the house began to feel different. The air in certain rooms turned icy cold, so cold that Sarah would wrap Emily in blankets. Even though the summer heat sweltered outside, the old wooden doors sometimes slammed shut on their own, rattling the walls. At night, faint scratching sounds crept along the walls of Polly's bedroom, like claws dragging through plaster. Sarah tried to reason it away. Houses settle, she told herself. Drafts make doors move, but the excuses sounded hollow when Polly began waking with red marks on her arms, thin curved scratches that looked like claws. One morning Thomas found her in the kitchen, her nightgown torn at the sleeve. He gasped when he saw 3 deep marks etched across her shoulder blade. "Polly," he whispered, "what happened?" She glanced at him with tired eyes. "The man in the corner," she said softly. "What man?" Thomas asked, his heart pounding. "He does not like me," Polly whispered. Then, as if the words had slipped out against her will, she pressed her lips together and said nothing more. Thomas told his parents. Daniel shook his head, muttering that kids bruise themselves in their sleep. Sarah hesitated. She wanted to believe her husband, but deep inside she felt the growing weight of dread. The house became restless. Nights grew unbearable. Polly would wake screaming, her voice shrill enough to rattle windows. Emily cried often, saying Polly stood over her bed while she slept, not smiling, just staring. Sarah took Polly to the town's general practitioner. The doctor found nothing. No infections, no skin condition to explain the scratches. He prescribed vitamins and suggested Polly might be experiencing sleepwalking. The weeks passed and Polly grew weaker. Her skin turned ashen. Her eyes, once a soft gray, seemed to glaze with a strange sheen that unsettled anyone who met her gaze. One night Sarah entered Polly's room after hearing whispers. At first, she thought Polly was talking in her sleep, but as she crept closer, the words chilled her blood. Polly's lips were moving, but the voice that spilled out was not her own. It was lower, guttural, filled with malice. The language was unrecognizable, ancient, as if it came from beneath the earth itself. Sarah backed away, heart racing. When Polly opened her eyes, they flashed with something foreign. And for the first time, Sarah could no longer convince herself it was imagination. Something was in her daughter's room, something that lingered around Polly like a shadow that refused to leave. Chapter 3: Fear in the House. The Williams house grew heavy with silence. Where once there had been the laughter of children and the warmth of daily life, now there was only tension, broken by strange sounds that echoed through the halls at night. Polly no longer seemed like herself. Her cheeks had hollowed, her lips often cracked from dryness. She spoke less during the day, but when she did, her words carried an edge that unsettled her brother and sister. Thomas began avoiding her gaze, while Emily refused to sleep unless Sarah stayed in the room until she drifted off. It was not only Polly's words that frightened them, it was the way she watched them. Long, unblinking stares that seemed to peel into their thoughts. One evening Thomas sat on the couch, trying to focus on his homework. Polly sat across the room, legs tucked under her, staring at him. He finally snapped. "What?" he asked sharply. Polly tilted her head. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a strange echo that made Thomas's stomach knot. "You will die first." Thomas froze, his pencil clattering to the floor. He wanted to believe she was only teasing, but the way her eyes shone made it clear she meant every word. Emily grew terrified of her older sister. She complained of waking at night to see Polly standing in the doorway, her head tilted unnaturally, whispering things that made no sense. When Sarah asked Polly about it, she only smiled faintly and said she did not remember. The strange happenings grew stronger. Objects shifted across tables without anyone touching them. Doors rattled violently in their frames. The temperature in Polly's room dropped so drastically that her breath misted in the air, though it was still the peak of summer. Sarah tried to hold the family together. She called the hospital in the next town, begging for more tests, but the doctors could only shrug. They found no infection, no neurological condition, nothing that explained the scratches that still appeared on Polly's body every few nights. Daniel tried to be the rock, insisting there was always a logical reason, but even he began to falter. The night Polly's voice changed. It was just after midnight when Sarah shook him awake. She had heard noises from Polly's room, a strange muttering. Together they crept down the hall. The door was open a crack, and inside Polly was sitting upright in bed. Her lips moved quickly, but the voice that spilled into the dark was guttural and deep. It sounded older, crueler, filled with something ancient. "Polly," Sarah whispered. Her daughter turned her head slowly, far too slowly. Her eyes glazed with a sickly film. When she spoke, her voice seemed to echo in the walls. "She is mine," Sarah gasped. Daniel stepped forward, anger masking his fear. "Stop this right now," he snapped. "Enough of these games." Polly's face twisted into a smile that did not belong on a child. Her teeth gleamed in the dim light. "You cannot stop me." The air turned icy, and the lamp by the bedside table burst with a sharp pop. Sarah screamed. Daniel pulled her back, slamming the door shut, his hands trembling. For the first time, the practical father could not explain what he had seen. By morning, Polly was back to her quiet self, sipping at her breakfast as though nothing had happened. But Sarah saw the faint smile tug at the corners of Polly's lips. A smile too knowing, too cruel to belong to their little girl. The Williams house had become a place of shadows, and though no one said it aloud, every soul inside knew the truth. Something had claimed Polly and it was growing stronger.
Chapter 4. The haunting intensifies. The Williams home no longer felt like a safe place. It felt like a trap, a cage, where something unseen walked the halls with them. Polly's changes grew worse with each passing day. Her eyes sometimes clouded with a strange, milky glaze that made her look less like a child and more like something hollow. Her once soft voice turned sharp, laced with cruel humor. She taunted her siblings with words that cut deeper than any child her age should have known. One morning, Emily refused to come down for breakfast. When Sarah went to fetch her, the little girl was curled beneath her blankets, trembling. "She told me," Emily whispered, clutching her mother's arm. She told me she was going to peel my skin off while I sleep. Sarah's stomach twisted. She wanted to deny it, to insist her daughter had misunderstood, but she could not. She had seen the way Polly now smiled at her siblings, lips curling in delight at their fear. Thomas tried to stand his ground, but even he was shaken. One evening he stormed into the kitchen, face pale, voice unsteady. "She was in my room," he said. "She was standing over me, just staring. When I told her to leave, she said my blood was already hers." Sarah pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Daniel muttered about discipline, about ending these games, but his voice lacked conviction. Deep inside, he knew this was beyond anything he could control. The house itself seemed to respond to Polly's moods. When she was angry, the walls shook with violent knocks. Doors slammed so hard that frames cracked. At night, claw marks appeared on furniture, gouges deep and fresh as if something unseen had raked through the wood. The temperature dropped without warning. Sometimes Sarah would find her breath fogging in the air, as if she had stepped into a winter storm. The air grew so heavy in Polly's room that it pressed against the chest, making it hard to breathe. One night, Sarah entered Polly's room to check on her. The child was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her hands folded in her lap. The shadows in the room seemed deeper than the rest of the house, pooling thick in the corners. "Polly," Sarah said gently, "come to bed, honey." Polly's head lifted slowly. When she spoke, her voice was not her own. "She does not sleep anymore." Sarah's breath caught. "Who doesn't?" she whispered. The smile that spread across Polly's lips chilled her blood. "Me." Her voice shifted, deep and guttural, filling the room with a vibration that made the lamp flicker. The walls groaned as if something massive pressed against them from the outside. Sarah stumbled backward, terror surging through her. Polly's eyes rolled back, leaving only white. Her body convulsed, limbs twisting in unnatural jerks. Sarah screamed for Daniel, and he came running, grabbing his daughter and shaking her. For a moment, Polly went limp. Then she gasped, blinking as if waking from a dream. Her voice was small again. "Daddy." Daniel clutched her to his chest, tears in his eyes. But Sarah saw the faint smile tug at the corners of Polly's lips. A smile too knowing, too cruel to belong to their little girl. By now, the Williams family was desperate. They had gone to the town's general practitioner, to the small hospital, but no one could help them. Polly's body weakened each day, her skin pale, her eyes sunken. No medicine or treatment eased her decline. At night, her siblings refused to sleep without their door locked. Even then, they swore they heard her pacing outside, whispering their names in the dark. The Williams house was no longer a home. It was a place of fear, where shadows stretched too long and the air always carried a chill. And at the center of it all sat Polly, her small body a vessel for something that had no intention of letting go.
Chapter 5. The village whispers traveled fast in Willow Creek. It was the kind of place where a broken fence or a new haircut found its way through the town before noon. What began in the Williams house could not stay hidden for long. Neighbors noticed first. The mailman, usually greeted by Polly's shy smile, claimed she had glared at him with eyes that did not belong to a child. A woman from the church said she saw Polly standing in the field at dusk, staring into the horizon, lips moving as though in conversation with someone unseen. The stories grew stranger. Some said they heard screaming from the Williams house at night. Not the cries of a child, but something darker, something that made dogs in the neighborhood bark and whine until dawn. Others whispered that they had seen claw marks gouged into the siding of the house, too high for any child to reach. The Williams family became a subject of hushed conversation in the aisles of the grocery store and in the pews of the church. Mothers clutched their children tighter when Polly's name was mentioned. A few even stopped sending their kids to play with Thomas and Emily, afraid that whatever plagued Polly might be contagious in some spiritual way. Inside the home, Sarah's nerves frayed with every passing day. She begged Daniel to seek help from the church, but he resisted. He was not a man of faith, not since his own father had died years ago, despite every prayer. To him, the church was comfort for the weak, not a cure for what plagued his daughter. But Sarah's pleas did not go unheard. Father Michael was young by the town's standards, barely past 30. He had been sent to Willow Creek only a year earlier, a quiet priest with kind eyes and a voice that carried calm even when speaking to crowded pews. He was not a man who invited attention, but he listened carefully to the murmurs of his flock, and he had heard the whispers about Polly Williams. At first he dismissed them as gossip. Small towns bred superstition, and children with strange behavior often became targets for rumor. But one night, after evening prayers, a woman stayed behind. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I live 3 houses from the Williams place," she confessed. "I swear on my life, Father, I saw that girl standing in her window last night, and her eyes were black as coal." Father Michael felt a chill move through him. He had heard tales in seminary, old stories of possession and oppression, warnings that demons were not relics of the past, but prowlers waiting for weakness. He had never expected to face such a thing himself. That night, as he knelt before the altar, he prayed for guidance. The candles flickered violently, though there was no draft. He took it as a sign. The next morning he walked the dirt road that led to the Williams house. It stood at the edge of the village, its paint peeling, its windows clouded. The fields around it seemed oddly still, as though even the wind avoided the place. When Sarah opened the door, the look in her eyes told him everything. She was pale, exhausted, her hands trembling as she clutched the doorframe. "Please," she whispered before he even introduced himself. "Please come in." Inside, the house was heavy with dread. The air felt colder than outside, carrying the faint scent of rot. He heard a soft laugh from the hallway, high-pitched yet somehow wrong. And then Polly appeared. She stood at the end of the hall, her nightdress hanging loose from her frail body. Her eyes, clouded in gray, fixed on him with unnatural stillness. "You should not be here," she said, in a voice that was not her own. Father Michael felt his skin prickle, his pulse quicken. He knew in that moment what the whispers had been trying to tell him. The child was no longer just a child. Something else had claimed her. Chapter 6. The Exorcism begins. Father Michael had read about possessions in old texts. He had studied accounts in the seminary, stories that felt more like warnings than history. But standing inside the Williams home, staring into the eyes of a 7-year-old girl that no longer looked entirely human, he realized that words on paper could never prepare a man for the real thing. Sarah clutched his arm, her voice shaking. "Can you help her, Father? Please tell me you can help her." He placed a steady hand over hers. "I will try, but you must understand this will not be easy. You will hear things, you will see things. You must not lose faith." Daniel hovered behind his wife, his jaw tight, sweat beading on his forehead. His disbelief had been stripped away piece by piece, until nothing remained but fear. He nodded silently, unable to meet the priest's eyes. Father Michael asked for a quiet room, one with enough space. They chose Polly's bedroom, though the thought of entering it made Sarah shiver. The walls there were already scarred with claw marks, and the air seemed to pulse with a heaviness that made every breath an effort. Polly sat on the bed when they entered. She did not move, but her eyes tracked them like a predator studying prey. "Good morning, Father," she said, though the voice that left her lips was guttural, coated in venom. Michael drew a crucifix from his pocket and held it firmly. "I will speak to the child," he said clearly, "not to you." The thing inside Polly smiled, and it was not a child's smile. Her lips curled too wide, her teeth glinting in the dim light. "You think you have authority here," it hissed. "She is mine. She has been chosen." Sarah covered her mouth with trembling hands, muffling a sob. Thomas and Emily, pressed against the doorway, clung to each other with wide eyes. Michael began with prayer, his voice calm and steady even as the walls seemed to shudder. He sprinkled holy water across the room. It hissed where the droplets touched Polly's skin, raising welts on her arms. She screamed, not with her own voice but with a sound so deep it rattled the windows. Daniel lunged forward instinctively, but Michael raised a hand. "Stay back. Do not touch her." The air in the room dropped to freezing. Frost bloomed along the window panes. The lights flickered and went out, leaving only the pale glow of the priest's candle. Michael's words grew louder. "In the name of Christ, leave this child." Polly thrashed violently, her small frame convulsing with strength no 7-year-old should possess. Her limbs jerked against the mattress, her body rising inches into the air before slamming back down. Her voice roared through the room. "You have no power here. She is the vessel. She is the door." Michael pressed the crucifix against her forehead. The metal seared, and she screamed again, her eyes rolling back until only white remained. The bed shook beneath her as if struck by an unseen force. "By the authority of heaven," Michael cried, his voice straining, "you will leave her body." The room exploded in sound. Objects rattled off the shelves. The dresser slammed against the wall, and the door behind the children slammed shut with a thunderous crack. Thomas and Emily shrieked, but Sarah grabbed them, pulling them close. Polly's voice turned mocking, layered with many tones at once. "You will fail, priest. Your faith is thin. You fear the dark. We know what haunts you." Michael's chest tightened. The words cut too close, yet he forced his voice louder, commanding with every ounce of conviction he had left. The house seemed to rage in answer. Wind howled through the sealed room, scattering papers, slamming drawers open and shut. Shadows thickened, crawling along the walls as if alive. Michael closed his eyes and gripped the crucifix so tightly his knuckles whitened. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you leave this child. Polly arched upward, a scream bursting from her throat so sharp it seemed to split the air. For a moment everything shook, the walls, the floor, the very air itself. Then, with a suddenness that left silence ringing in the ears, Polly collapsed onto the bed. Her small chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Her lips parted as she whispered weakly, "Mummy." Sarah rushed forward, clutching her daughter in her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she rocked Polly against her chest. Michael lowered the crucifix, sweat dripping down his temples. He knew this was not finished. The battle had only begun, and the entity would not leave without a final fight. Chapter 7. Battle for Polly. The Williams house trembled, as though it knew the war being waged inside. The family huddled near the bedroom door while Father Michael stood firm at the foot of the bed. His hands shook from exhaustion, but he held the crucifix aloft, the candle beside him guttering in the draftless room. Polly lay on the mattress, her chest heaving. For a moment it seemed she might be free. Her eyes fluttered, clear gray once more. She whispered faintly, "Help me." Then her body stiffened, her back arched with impossible force, and her mouth opened wide in a scream that did not belong to a child. The sound rolled through the house, deep and resonant, shaking the very floorboards. The air turned foul, heavy with the stench of rot. The candle blew out, plunging the room into darkness, save for the thin moonlight that leaked through the frost-coated window. When Polly spoke again, it was not in English. The words were guttural, ancient, like the sound of stone grinding against stone. Her small frame lifted from the bed, rising higher and higher until she hung suspended. Limbs twisted unnaturally, hair floating as if underwater. Emily shrieked and buried her face in Sarah's skirt. Thomas clutched his mother's arm, eyes wide with terror. The voice thundered from Polly's mouth. "She is ours. She is chosen. You cannot take her." Father Michael's knees buckled beneath the weight of the voice, but he forced himself upright. His pulse hammered, his breath came ragged, yet he lifted the crucifix higher. "In the name of the Lord Almighty," he cried, "you will leave her body. You will not harm this child any longer." The entity laughed through Polly, a cruel, echoing sound that chilled the blood of everyone who heard it. "You think your God will protect you. You think faith will keep me out. She invited me. She wanted me. She called to the dark and I came." Sarah's sobs filled the room. She remembered Polly's words months before, about those who did not want to stay gone. Her daughter had not understood what she saw, but the thing had been near her all along, waiting. Michael pressed forward, the crucifix shaking in his grip. He recited the words of the rite, his voice growing hoarse, forcing strength into each syllable as the walls rattled violently. Polly's body convulsed in midair, twisting as if breaking from within. Black veins pulsed across her pale skin. Her eyes flew open, now pools of pitch that reflected no light. "Father Michael," the voice mocked, spitting his name with venom. "We know you. We know your weakness. We know the nights you doubt. We know the silence that frightens you when you pray." The words pierced him. His doubts, his fears, laid bare in front of the family. For an instant, his voice faltered. The shadows in the corners thickened, stretching across the floor toward him. But then Polly screamed, not the demon's voice, but her own, thin and terrified. "Please, help me." The cry snapped him back. His doubts fell away, and in their place came a raw surge of conviction. He shouted the prayer louder than ever, his voice rising above the storm in the room. "In the name of Christ the Savior, I command you leave this child." The crucifix blazed in the moonlight as though catching fire. Polly writhed in the air, the guttural voice roaring in agony. Her body slammed back down onto the mattress, the frame splintering beneath her. For one final moment, silence fell. Then Polly's mouth opened, and a black mist poured forth, writhing like smoke, alive with hatred. It swirled in the room, lashing against the walls, shrieking in fury before vanishing into nothing. The weight in the air lifted. The frost melted from the window. The house groaned as though exhaling after holding its breath. Polly lay limp on the bed, pale but breathing. Slowly, her eyes opened. They were clear again, soft gray, filled with tears. "Mummy," she whispered. Sarah rushed to her, clutching her daughter tightly, sobbing with relief. Thomas and Emily pressed close, crying into her arms. Father Michael lowered the crucifix, his chest heaving, his skin drenched with sweat. He knew it was over. The child had been freed, but as he glanced at his trembling hands, he felt something cold deep within him, a shadow he could not shake. The battle had been won, but the war might not have ended. Chapter 8. Aftermath. The Williams home fell into silence after the final scream faded. No more rattling doors, no more freezing air pressing against the lungs. The house seemed lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from its beams and walls. Polly slept for nearly a full day after the exorcism. Sarah never left her side, sitting at the edge of the bed and holding her daughter's hand, brushing strands of hair from her damp forehead. Emily nestled against her mother, refusing to let go, while Thomas paced the hall, too restless to sit, too frightened to sleep. When Polly finally woke, she blinked slowly, her gray eyes clear once more. She turned to her mother and whispered a single word, "Home." Sarah broke down in tears, clutching her daughter so tightly that Polly squeaked in protest. But Polly smiled faintly, a true smile, tired but real. For the first time in months, she looked like a child again. The days that followed brought slow recovery. The claw marks on her arms and shoulders faded, her appetite returned. She no longer whispered in her sleep or stared at the corners of the room as if watching something no one else could see. Emily slept soundly in her own bed again, and Thomas dared to speak to his sister without fear. Neighbors noticed the change. The strange sounds from the Williams home ceased. The whispers in town began to quiet. The family returned to the routines of life, fragile but intact. But Father Michael was not the same. He had stayed at the house for another day, watching over Polly, guiding the family in prayer. He offered them comfort, reminding them that faith had carried them through. His words were steady, but his hands shook when he held the Bible. On the morning of his departure, Sarah thanked him again and again, tears in her eyes. "He saved her, she saved her," she said. "We owe you everything." Father Michael smiled faintly, though the smile never reached his eyes. His skin was pale, slick with cold sweat despite the warm day. His movements were slower, more deliberate, as if his body no longer obeyed him as it once had. As he stepped onto the porch, Thomas noticed something. The priest's head tilted just slightly to one side, too far to be natural, as though his neck carried an unseen weight. "Father?" the boy asked quietly. Michael turned his head, his eyes dim and distant. For a heartbeat, Thomas thought he saw a shadow flicker across them, dark and unnatural, gone as quickly as it came. "I will be all right," the priest said softly. "Take care of your sister." And with that, he walked down the dirt road, the crucifix dangling loosely in his hand. He did not look back. The Williams family never saw him again. No one in the village did. Some said he left for another parish. Others claimed he had been called back by the diocese, but those who had seen him last swore. There was something different about the way he moved, the way his eyes seemed to catch the light in strange, unnatural ways. Polly Williams grew strong again, her childhood restored. She spoke less of shadows, less of voices, though sometimes when she was alone she would glance at the door, as if remembering something that once stood there. Life moved forward, as life always does. But at night, when the fields grew quiet and the wind sighed through the trees, Sarah sometimes woke with a start. She would swear she heard a voice just outside her window. A man's voice, low and heavy, whispering words she could not understand. She told herself it was only the wind. She had to believe it was only the wind, because the thought that something might have left Polly only to find another vessel was too much to bear. And somewhere far from Willow Creek, a pale priest walked alone, his head still tilted, his steps unsteady, his breath clouding in the warm summer air. The war had never ended. If you felt the cold fingers of this story brush your spine, make sure you don't miss the next haunted report. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us every weekend for more terrifying tales from the beyond. Because somewhere in the night, something is always watching, and it might be closer than you think.